All right. Yep. So as far as for this talk, it's about 25 minutes or so. It's mainly focused on the CVE side, CVE hunting. Um, Getting more on the offensive approach of side of things. So a little bit about me. My name is Lukas Kinneberg. Security engineer. Work here in town at BSides Electric. Got my MS in Information Systems. And a little bit of what I do there is I do most of our threat detection, threat hunting, a little bit of pen testing side of the house, more of the research side of the house for border states, and building out some of our detections that we have there. And kind of a lot, or I guess where this initially stemmed from, was working on some stuff through OffSec when I was working on my OSCP. I would say about half the time it seemed like I was hitting some type of WordPress CMS site when I was pen testing on it. So as I kind of finished that stuff up, I kind of moved into the beginnings of CVE hunting. A lot of things that I learned along the way. So I can share some of that and kind of how you can get started. And if you're not someone that is maybe into the CVE side of the house, there's a little bit in general about using WordPress for your business and just things to be mindful of just based off testing that I've done. So the agenda for today is why hunt in WordPress, knowing and how to pick your attack vector along the way. Once you find a bug, that's awesome, but how do you go about actually submitting that? And lastly, some lessons that I've learned along the way, both from attacking WordPress and getting a little bit outside my scope. And so I'll share some examples from there. So yeah, why exactly, or why would someone choose WordPress? And as far as for CMS sites out there, WordPress is the most widely used platform in the world. And one thing you'll learn early on in your security journey is that the larger attack surface that you have, the more apt you're probably going to find a vulnerability there. In particular with WordPress, there's over 60K plugins that are available. And I would say, I'm not sure the amount of public versus private or paid plugins, but I'm guessing about 90+% of those are public free plugins that anybody can download and put on their WordPress site. So really, for a business to one-to-one WordPress, the only cost is probably running your server up front. WordPress is free to use. The plugins are free to use. You'll oftentimes find out that you kind of pay for what you get with some of these. But the same holds true whether you do CV hunting or bug bounty hunting, that the larger attack surface you can find, the more apt you're going to find that vulnerability. And also in regards to the WordPress side versus going out there and testing manually against other applications, there is CVE numbering authorities, and within WordPress, many of them will provide much of the heavy lifting that you're going to encounter. When you start getting into some of those one-off programs or individual programs that developers might make, you'll oftentimes find that you're going and dealing directly with lighter, and you'll soon see there's a lot of overhead that you have to know how to do to store your vulnerability, reach out to the affected party and whatnot. And that's one thing why WordPress is great, is there is authorities out there that help you with this along the way. And probably my favorite thing is when you are starting out doing your CVE hunting, you'll find oftentimes that you're going to mess up, and you're going to mess up many times. It's a lot less of a headache when you mess up on WordPress, just because you can run your own instance. So a lot of times what I'll do for this, I spin up a local VM, and I go in there, I install my WordPress VM, my WordPress instance, and then I drop my plugins in there, and I'll start pen testing or CVE hunting against those. When you start going against live sites for CVEs, and that kind of blends into the bug bounty side, you'll start hitting things such as your WAFs and your gateways and things like that. And at that point is if you don't know how to throttle your stuff, you don't know what you're doing, you're going to get yourself and probably your ISP banned off the internet. And a lot of them are fronted, you'll find out very frequently by Akamai. So it restricts your access to a lot of things. So that's one of the things I love about starting out in your CVE journey and going with WordPress is you can run a local instance, whether you're going to be doing some type of cross-site scripting, some type of SQL injection. You can use any of the automated tooling out there. And about the extent of what is going to happen is you might take down your own system. It's now a bit on the CNAs. I did kind of mention on this that they help you along quite a bit for the WordPress side of the house. And I didn't realize initially how many CNAs are out there. Currently, as of last week, when I looked this up, there's about 400 plus CNAs. And many of these actually have a jurisdiction to delegate or assign CVEs within their authority. So you might think, well, what does that actually mean? So if you get a WordPress vulnerability, you're not going to submit this under Microsoft. You're not going to submit this under Google. They don't have authority in that area to assign a CVE. There's a few out there. A few of the primary ones are WordFence, WP Scan, and then PatchStack. Just a bit of a tidbit. This will mostly focus on WP Scan. That's how I submit my stuff. If you are going out there and hunting for a larger vulnerability, there is a potential for payout on these CVEs. And one of the examples that is out there that I'd like to mention was what WordFence did last year. So they had something what was known as their holiday extravaganza. It was paying out about 6 times the average bounty last year, last November, last December. And what that came out to, I think anything, it was either above 100,000 or 500,000 install base. And then it had to have a crit vulnerability, was a 10K payout. And then on the low side, I think it had to have at least a 50K install base. But they're pushing out close to, I think it was like 1,500 on the low side. So my guess is they're probably doing something similar here in the coming months, coming to Christmas. You'll probably see WordFence do something similar. With WP Scan though, I don't think they pay out for any vulnerabilities. And I will say, and you'll find out pretty quick, that when you are starting your CVE hunting side of the house, when you start going after those well-vetted plugins, the more installed ones, going after a bounty on those to get paid out, there's a lot of researchers that are hitting those. So you have to bring something different to the table that they're not going to do. What I love about WP Scan is we hit some of those lower level plugins that aren't as popular. You're not going to get paid, but you're going to be able to publish your research, get it out there, and show a little bit of what you can do. So as far as on the WP Scan side, I can't speak on WordFence and PatchStack if they do the same thing. I believe they do. But the major thing that I like about WP Scan is when you find that vulnerability and you submit it, is they'll do all the scoring on their behalf. So there's a giant sheet you gotta fill out for a CVSS and showing how you score it. And then oftentimes you gotta go out, you gotta touch base with the developer and explain kind of what the vulnerability is. And sometimes you'll go as far as even providing remediation steps. As far as early in your CVE journey, if you don't have, especially in WordPress, if you don't have a web app development background, it's going to be a bit difficult to probably talk to someone about how they should remediate something if you're just primarily focused on the attack front. But dealing with any of these authorities, whether it's a small or a large vulnerability, they're going to do a lot of the heavy lifting for you. So now onto the front of, you have your CNAs, you want to pick one that you maybe want to go with. I can say if you hit something pretty heavy, I would start looking into the paid side of the house with PatchStack or WordFence. They're going to pay out for those. If you're not too concerned about that, WP Scan's great. They have a built-in vuln scanner too. So if you ever attack WordPress and you use WP Scan, your vulnerability will end up in there if you do find it. And I can say this from my work in doing some CVE hunting in WordPress, I would say this definitely holds true to what you see. So this is something that was put out by PatchStack, and it lists some of the most common vulnerabilities that you see in your WordPress sites. And the leading front up there is your cross-site scripting, followed a lot by some broken access control, SQL injection, things like that. For my front, when you kind of go out and you decide you want to attack WordPress, I would highly recommend determining what kind of attack vector you want. I wouldn't go, you can install plugins and just start manually hitting stuff with different attack vectors. The approach that I usually recommend for some of these is you pick something that you really want to go after, whether it's a cross-site scripting, a SQL injection, and then start finding plugins that you think might match what those vulnerabilities may be. And I'll talk about that in the next slide, how you can kind of identify a plugin that you want to go after, or what might be a good plugin to attack. But for my testing out here, I can definitely say I didn't do much on the cross-scripting side. Most of my research I did was SQL injection. That's where I found my stuff at. But I would say, yeah, for the most of the stuff that I did searched, I would say most stuff like more often than not, there's quite a bit of cross-site scripting vulnerabilities in there. And they do accept both reflected and stored cross-site scripting. So now on to the plugin side. And this is kind of the bulk of maybe trying to find that CVE. So what you'll do is you'll go on to WordPress.org, and you can go out there and you can start to search manually across your plugins for anything that looks of interest. One of the big things I always do is I use a search bar when I'm on the WordPress site to look for certain themes of the plugins. So for example, there's one off to the right that I think I searched for like church or something like that. I tend to see a lot of, when you search for like church, like sports boards, things like that, more independently developed stuff that maybe isn't well vetted out. So something like this, you know, if you were to go after this, this would be a valid plugin if you found something in here that you could submit and get a CVE underneath. From my side of the house, I would say there's 3 really important things that I pay attention to when looking at a plugin. And that's the last update, the active installations, and then the change log that's associated with it. So in this instance, when I look at the last update, I see it's 5 days ago. That might be something that's worth going after. If I see something that's frequently updated, it might be signs that there's already people that are hitting that plugin. Additionally, I look at the active installations, and I would say this is probably the biggest, I would say, indicator of whether something's worth going after. And it's also the indicator of whether you're going to get paid or not if you find something against the plugin. As far as the active installation basis, it seems like from what I've seen, once you hit above about, I would say 10,000, you'll start to see more of a change log. It seems like that they're actively maintaining their plugin and things like that. So as far as, you know, the last update, the active installations, I love if you're doing a first-time search, something in that 1,000 range is usually a pretty good indicator of something to maybe attack. I would say the biggest thing to pay attention to is their change log. When you go into any of these plugins and you search across them, we'll have a history of the changes that are along the way and everything that has been done. So kind of in this example here, this is from the same plugin. I don't know what the plugin name was, but you can see there's the update, the installations, which they look pretty good for maybe attack vectors. When you start looking into the actual change log side of the house, it probably isn't something that if you were trying to find a CVE and that would probably go after. For example, if you were after a cross-site scripting vuln and you went to the change log, you can see that early on in 5.1.18 and then 4.0.27 that there was cross-site scripting vulnerabilities, and then they list where it's found at within their plugin. So in this instance, this might be a pass on what I was looking at. If this was something that maybe had an active installation base of, 100,000 installs or something like that, and there was only a few, items in the change log relating to potential patches that were done, then it might be worthwhile going after. So now you kind of found your bug. Once you find your attack vector, you pick what you want, cross-site scripting, SQL injection. You look through the plugins, you find your installation base, how often it's updated, is there a sporadic change log, things like that. So as you go through and you start testing stuff, and honestly, for most of what you want to hit these websites with, if you run through Burp Academy, most of what they'll show in their labs there, you can hit these WordPress plugins with and probably find something. So it's nothing for a lot of these lower end plugins that has to be some type of groundbreaking injection that you're trying to do. But after you kind of pick something out and then you find something, then comes the course eventually of trying to go through and submit your bug. So here is an example of a SQL injection that I found. It was against a grade book in this case. A little bit about it, ended up scoring like a 9. I think it was a 9.6 or a 9.8. So essentially anyone that ran this plugin, I was able to show to the developer that you could dump the entire WordPress database with this exploit. So I went through and I made my submission. The only thing in the submission through WP Scan is you look on their website, you'll fill in a few things about the description, the title, kind of what it does, and then usually you can upload some images or videos along the way. I highly recommend making videos if you find something. They actually go through on their end and they're going to replicate everything. And the less questions that they have to ask, the more apt they can just push it through past your initial submission. And that's really the only context you have to have. But in this instance, it wasn't a heavily utilized plugin. While it scored high on the CVE rankings, but the timeline for me, what I saw, was roughly about 6 to 8 weeks. And that was from the initial, when I submitted the CVE to when the final scheduled disclosure came through from WP Scan, and you're allowed to kind of release your research and your findings at that point. So it's a series of maybe 3 or 4 emails on your submission. You'll get an email back from WP Scan. It's going to assign a specific priority to it. And then you'll see an email a few weeks later that shows that goes into a reviewing status. And that's where they attempt to replicate whatever you're showing in your video or what you're describing. If it does pass, you'll get a signing to it or a CVE assigned to it. And WP Scan is a CNA, which is what allows them to assign a CVE in this case. And then finally, there's a scheduled disclosure, and they'll just show some dates on there, and you can release your stuff from there. But really, the only thing you have to know up front is be as specific as you can up front. The more specific, the less work it's going to be on your end down the road. In this case, once I submitted my stuff, I didn't have to do anything until the actual submission came back. And one interesting thing about WordPress is they give the developers so many days to fix their stuff. If they don't fix their plugin, it gets pulled from the store. So even if it's an actively used plugin, they have, I think is it 30 days, I think, to respond. And if they don't, then it gets pulled from the store. You'll still get your CVE, it's assigned, it's published, and then once they fix it, it will re-hit the store back again for WordPress. So just a quick tidbit on the SLAs. They have three different items or priorities that are assigned to your CVE. It's high, normal, and low. You'll actually select this when you do submit it. And it's based entirely, for the most part, on the install base. I would say once you're getting above the low, when you start pushing the normal and the high, you might want to start shopping around at that point to see if you can get anything for it. If you are in that high range, I definitely would shop for it, because you'll probably get paid out for it. But the SLA times, if it's in that low range, which I would say most of their plugins are, they get for vulnerabilities. There's no SLA, but that's kind of where that 6 to 8 week time frame comes in. Anything above that, it seems like it's within a couple weeks. Everything's in order. So lastly, you go out there, you find your attack vector, you find something interesting, you go through and you submit it. And the last step along the way is trying to publish your findings in your CVE. So when you can submit, you're going to get an email from WP-Scan. It's going to show that the vendor was contacted and there's a scheduled disclosure. At that point, you can honestly go into the WordPress vulnerability database and you can search to see if your stuff shows up. Once it shows up there, it's fair game to release anything on ExploitDB or anything like that. One thing that is important though, as any type of bug that you do find, whether it's WordPress or really anything, is you need to adhere to the terms of service for the vulnerability. Meaning don't publish anything that you find ahead of time, no matter how big or how small it is. It's out of respect for the developer. But it will be published by the CNA, and once you see that, it is fair game to publish the actual exploit of what you found. And I did mention this already, but WP-Scan will communicate with the plugin developer for anything you do find. So as long as, you don't have to go through WP-Scan, for example, to submit your bug. You can go directly to MITRE as the master root authority. But at that point, you're having to communicate with the developer. They might ask for potential remediation steps for how to fix this. You have to score your own vulnerability and things like that. So by going through some of these CNAs like WordFence, WP-Scan, PatchStack, they're going to do that all for you. The only heavy lifting you have is finding the bug and then submitting it. And lastly, this was focused on WP-Scan, but kind of the cool things you'll see is your plugin, your research winds up in the vulnerability database. And additionally, it should wind up in the WP-Scan tool, which is their open source free tool for WordPress scanning. So lastly, a few lessons that I've learned along the way. There is a limited scope that exists with this because you're testing on your own system, but they do still exist, and that's something to be mindful of. With the, one example I have here, and I did come across was embedded site content using a WordPress plugin. So an example of that would be if you have your own website and you're embedding maybe documents or something like that through your plugin that kind of reach directly back out to your website. So something like that, it's entirely out of scope. I ran into a few issues with that early on, trying to determine the scope of what I could actually test. And I think one of the ones I actually found was actually from a startup, smaller healthcare company that was embedding HIPAA documents for HIPAA compliancy, and they actually were embedding their stuff through a WordPress plugin. And as I was testing it and hitting it, it was popping over onto their website side, and it ended up being a stored cross-site scripting, and they had insecure cookies on their website, which was a complete mess. But when I submitted an example like that through to WP-Scan, they just mentioned that this is out of scope, that this doesn't lie technically in WordPress, although they are using a WordPress plugin they created. The actual vulnerability exists on their site for this HIPAA company. But some other vulnerabilities along the way, they do allow some items to occur. Most notably, and I'm not going to go too much into it, but it's the unfiltered HTML capability, and this only applies for cross-site scripting. And long story short, what it really does is it allows, you have certain roles in WordPress, like an editor or the owner, And there's certain fields that you're technically allowed to use script tags in for cross-site scripting. So you'll get false positives for that. So, but they go through, the WP scan team does on what that is and why they allow it. And at the end of the day, I always say, don't be afraid to submit your vulnerability through. The folks over there at WP Scan are super helpful. So if you find something and it's maybe out of scope or it doesn't apply, they'll let you know and they'll tell you why. And you'll learn fairly quickly as you start to submit stuff, what is going to get accepted and what won't get accepted. But early on, if you think you found something, definitely submit it. Worst thing they say is they'll say no. So lastly, just to wrap everything up, from a WordPress side or WordPress standpoint, I know I talked a little bit about the vulnerabilities. There's a large attack surface. It's largely community driven, which is why it's so popular. But inherently, WordPress is secure. In fact, for all the vulnerabilities that came out this last year, I think they said it was like 0.22% of them actually existed in the core WordPress OS, meaning that the other 99.78 vulnerabilities that exist in WordPress are outside of the core system. They come in through plugins and themes are the main things. As far as for the running of WordPress, many companies do run their own form of WordPress. I know, speaking from experience from my end, what makes WordPress a bit dangerous is you don't need a web developer necessarily to run that system. It's just someone that can hop in there and they can type some stuff in and use a theme or a plugin to convey what they need. And one of the largest issues with that is a lot of times these WordPress instances live outside the scope of your IT department. I can say almost in every company I've worked at, in some form or another, it seemed like it was the marketing or like our communications department that would have the kind of the keys and the reins to the WordPress site. And it kind of gave them the freedom to do so, to install whatever they wanted. So just some remarks on that is just making sure that you're using reputable plugins and that they have been vetted out. Specifically those lower install based plugins, you can have a high CVE on those and it can end up dropping a lot of data if you're not aware of what you're actually installing. And a great way to look at that, and we kind of went through earlier, was the change log. So if you do find something that maybe isn't as well vetted out or not is on an install base, it's a free plugin. Always go through and check the change log to see if they're patching their vulnerabilities, and if they're documenting stuff along the way that it happens. And I think what makes WordPress an interesting attack vector is in the recent years, it's been a huge resurgence in the supply chain attack vectors. There hasn't been too much of a talk about that, I would say, pre-COVID, but post-COVID, you're starting to see a lot of third-party software introduced into companies, and that's how they're getting breached, meaning you can harden your stuff and put as much security controls in place as you want, but oftentimes you're not the one developing the security on these third-party software things, such as WordPress. And so doing your vetting out of these supply chains and the software that you bring in will go a long way. And particularly paying attention to ones that allow you to download and install, open source content that's provided by the community. So yeah, just a few kind of references along the way. Patch Stack has a bunch of their stuff out there for the numbers and interesting stuff from the last year in end of 2023. Some resources along the way from the WP Scan team, showing it into CVE hunting, bug bounty, whatever it may be. Highly encouraged to go through Port Spider's Burp Academy. It's pretty awesome. And one interesting item I did find, there is some static scanners out there that exist for WordPress. So I mentioned there's WP Scan, it's a vuln scanner, but if you are CVE hunting, you can go out there and search on the web and search for a static scanner for your WordPress plugins, because when you install your WordPress plugin, you'll get the source code as well. So you can run these scanners against the source code, and some of them will actually pick out not necessarily the line, but they'll give you an idea if there is a potential for a cross-site scripting or a SQL injection vulnerability in what you're trying to test. And yeah, that's all I got.